Alrighty, hello. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who are sovereign on this land. I'm heartened by the struggles that occur on this land, including the Tent Embassy, which is in its 50th anniversary year this year. I also pay my respects to First Nations people in this room, including the amazing women and mothers. Today I'll share findings from a project I conducted with First Nations scholars Larissa, Behrendt, Gemma Sentance and Michelle Toy, and with the leadership of a group we set up called Sister to Sister, a local First Nations women's group in Sydney that supported the research and designed the project, especially the powerful contribution of Auntie Bronwyn Penrith. But mostly, I first want to thank the amazing Aboriginal women in prison who were involved in the project and responded to our calls to be part of the yarning circles. So the project involved these yarning circles with 162 First Nations women in 8 prisons in New South Wales. We visited each prison at least twice and heard stories of injustice, oppression and harm in prison. But overwhelmingly, we were told about the women's roles, responsibilities, and lives as mothers and carers. This is the aspect of the research that I especially want to focus on today. We were repeatedly told that cultural transmission and strengthening of First Nations families and communities requires mothers, grandmothers, aunties, and big sisters to be decarcerated. However, before I launch into the project's research findings, I want to historically locate the experiences of First Nations mothers. Generally in criminology, we overlook history. We take a positivist approach. We tend to describe. And so I think it's crucial for us to reflect on incarceration, especially because it has a very colonial focus that has been enduring for hundreds of years. So elsewhere, I've argued that hyperincarceration of First Nations people has been a key strategy for the colonial project. It's taken on many guises, as shown in the slide. Containment or carceralism first took place following the initial violence against First Nations people on the eastern frontier, which nonetheless continued into the 20th century in other parts of Australia. By the mid-19th century, it became a key colonial mechanism, that is carceralism, for managing First Nations people and stamping out culture and connections to country. In essence, it was a means to conquer the land and to suppress resistance. Before then, as emphasised by First Nations scholars such as the late Maori scholar Moana Jackson, as well as Yolngu scholar and knowledge holder in Northern Australia, James Gaykamanku, they say that prisons did not exist as part of their First Nations law. The early carceral period, what I call palliative carceralism, because the justification was to smooth the natives' dying pillow, as they said, this was a social Darwinist idea, and it involved incarcerating First Nations people on missions, ration depots, and lock hospitals. Indeed, incarceration tended to expedite the death of First Nations people, including due to the proliferation of diseases in confined spaces. And we very well know this now following the COVID period and the transmission of COVID in prisons. The succeeding period I call protective carceralism. It was justified on the grounds that Aboriginal people couldn't care for themselves and they needed to be protected by white saviours. From 1868, initially in Victoria, the role of the Aboriginal protector was established, and then Aboriginal Protection Acts were rolled out across the country, providing wide sweeping powers over Aboriginal lives. It was influenced by the 1837 British Parliamentary Select Committee on Aboriginal Tribes that promoted this idea that discipline, routines, and Christianity should be enforced on government settlements and missions. So while that had an aspect of assimilation, the following period was very consciously assimilationist. This is called, or what I refer to as, welfare carceralism. And basically, welfare legislation became the vehicle for segregating First Nations people. There was an especial focus on Aboriginal children meeting the standards of Anglo-Saxon people, and they were usually incarcerated on residential schools. So while the Aboriginal Acts went into demise in the 1950s, Aboriginal people came to be wards of the state, and most remained incarcerated on settlements. During this epoch, colonial policy sought to bring them in line with this notion of citizenship, and yet granted none of the rights of being a citizen. So it was the 1960s when we saw a shift to these formal citizenship rights and the release of people, of Aboriginal people, of Torres Strait Islander people from missions, orphanages and government settlements. This is also the time that saw the demise in the United States of the segregationist Jim Crow laws. However, waiting in the wings was the state police force. As with African Americans in the United States, First Nations people became targeted by racialised policing and in turn prosecutors and courts. This period is thus referred to, as I call it, penal-carceralism. It's our current period, because the justification of locking up masses of First Nations people is punishment for a crime. But it's the same thing we've been doing from the beginning. And I raise this history because in all their guises, it is seared into the lives of First Nations mothers currently in prison. This intergenerational harm and trauma is part of their lived reality. It is not a history. And it is reinforced and wounds are open every time they're in police lockup and penal imprisonment. First Nations Professor Aileen Moreton-Robinson regards this as the ongoing patriarchal white sovereignty that continues to frame the lives of First Nations women. So I want to make one final point on historic incarceration. Even though I've emphasised the administrative and welfare aspects of carceralism until the 1970s, First Nations people have always been highly criminalised and punished. Often this in the past took the form of corporal punishment, summary punishment, slave labour at places like Rottnest Island in Western Australia, and the death sentence. First Nations scholar Callum Clayton-Dixon notes that Aboriginal people were denoted a criminal status to justify violent reprisals against them for the act of staying on their country. They were accused of trespass, cattle killing, assault and murder for their resistance. And criminology itself has been implicated in this. Since the very beginning with Cesare Lombroso, there has been a tendency to categorise criminals as savage and to relate them to those of the global south. And here are some of the ways in which the correlation was made with apes, and he made those direct connections. So while First Nations people may not be overtly characterised as savages, there's now a different type of discourse at play. It relates to risk. It relates to First Nations people lacking self-control, including as it relates to alcohol and drugs. There is a focus on the violence of First Nations men and, in line with carceral feminism, the need for more imprisonment in response to such violence. Yet First Nations women are also typecast as a risk, including a risk to their own children, and we know very much about the high rates of First Nations mothers losing their children to forced state removals. Where First Nations women are victims, it can also involve them having an engagement with the punitive system, such as through breach of protection orders. The research of Palawa woman and Professor Maggie Walter, as well as Kylie's own research, talks about the objectification and negative representation of First Nations victims that feeds into this narrative. So just to sum up in terms of penal carceralism as it is today and the role of criminology, I think what was a concern to us researchers in this project is that there is an overwhelming focus on the deficits, risks and problems of people in prison. This is also shown on some of the research headlines in the slide, where Indigenous people are studied in terms of their risk, in terms of what are their problems, and again classified as a problem population. And the product is that criminology naturalises the role of carceral interventions into the lives of First Nations people. Maggie Walter again asks, is it simply a coincidence that the British colonised places, including Aotearoa and Turtle Island, where the most criminals lived? Or could it be because of the colonial institutions themselves that have criminalised First Nations people? And so Ellen has spoken a bit about the hyper-incarceration trends, as this graph shows. There's overrepresentation in every jurisdiction, and First Nations people are the most imprisoned in the world. In terms of First Nations women, in New South Wales, 36% of the female prison population are First Nations women, and yet only 1.6% of the general population. Of these, 80% are mothers. Since 2013, again, as Eleanor said, the First Nations women population has increased higher than any other by 49%. And so if we took a risk lens, we would say that First Nations women were growing as a risk. They were more dangerous, rather than looking at the risk that the criminal justice agencies pose to First Nation women. I just put the following slide, sorry, that's the growth, but the following slide actually looks at what kind of questions criminology asks and what a decolonising approach, by contrast, asks. And it focuses much more on the harms of the state in incarcerating First Nations people rather than the harms of First Nations people themselves. It also focuses a lot more on strengths rather than deficits. So with this in mind, we conducted the research in New South Wales prisons with First Nations women. We established the group Sister to Sister, which was all First Nations women in the local community, to not only guide research, but to support the women. So when the women were released from prison, they could enter this group for support and solidarity. And we gave each of them a leaflet, that's our Sister to Sister logo, and it had information on the services provided by Sister to Sister and the supports. We approached the research with a storytelling and yarning methodology without judgment. We also had surveys in addition to the yarning, and we found that, interestingly, and perhaps to my surprise, women conveyed different things when they wrote in comparison to when they spoke. They also shared, in addition to responding to some of the questions about the carceral system, they also shared a lot of information in the yarning circles about themselves. And I really want to show this slide to you to indicate the strengths of the women, but also how insightful they are about what they need and what the system needs to move forward. But despite their strengths, the First Nations women describe their criminal records as haunting and shadowing their existence and erasing their identities as mothers. So one of them said, "We're not being treated like mothers. We're strong, independent Black women, and we deserve our rights, you know?" Another woman shared with us how prison stripped her of her cultural obligations and identity as a First Nations mother, and instead treated her as a number, as you can see on this slide. And she puts it really vividly, where she notes they just put in greens and stripped down names, and they gave us a 6-digit number. So removing a First Nations mother or caregiver from her child has a detrimental impact also on her child's identity, well-being, and relationship with family, community, and culture. We've seen in this during 2 parliamentary inquiries this year in Victoria and New South Wales on the impacts of incarceration on the children of those incarcerated. The loss of mothering can be especially devastating to children who are placed in out-of-home care as a result of their mother's imprisonment. One woman powerfully stated, "We talked a lot about closing the gap. You know how they create the gap? By taking our children away from us." And she goes on to say, by putting us behind bars. Another mother who was remanded for minor traffic matters shared the following: "Prison has affected my husband and children really bad. My husband was put on sleeping tablets. My children haven't been sleeping, missing a lot of school. My older daughter had to leave her job." And we heard really horrific stories about suicides as a result of the mother being taken into prison. They also despaired the milestones, celebrations, and funerals they missed as a result of being in prison. Others spoke about the trauma from docs taking their children due to a short-term remand, and then to cut off the visitation rights so the children wouldn't come and see them. One woman says that because she had lost 2 kids due to being in prison for the first time, she spiralled into depression. She says, at the end of the day, when I walk out of here, I've got nothing on the outside, I've got no home, I've got no reasons even to keep me grounded. So notwithstanding the struggles, what was really amazing was that First Nations women inside had thoughtfully reflected on the solutions. For many, it was not rehab or another institution, it was capacity to do what they knew their community needed. One of them spoke, for example, about setting up an animal shelter, so when women went inside, she would look after their pets. Another talked about teaching kids how to cook on the mish. This is the power of storytelling and self-determination. ALS CEO in New South Wales, Carly Warner, Palawa woman, states that First Nations communities have had the solutions for decades, but governments haven't shown the leadership to turn these ideas into action. The power of lived experience is that it provides meaningful input into policy making in a way that counters the deficit thinking and stereotypes I raised earlier. The solutions preferred by women range from systemic change to incremental change. Ultimately, the women propose that supports in the community should be bolstered. This would strengthen and support themselves, their families, and their children, who are always their priority. Some of the specific recommendations the women made included bail and sentencing reform, including the right to bail, especially for minor crimes. Given that First Nations women are disproportionately criminalised for minor matters such as traffic wrongs, driving without a licence and unregistered vehicles, public disorder, offensive language, shoplifting, and breach of orders, these should be things that bail is granted for. In relation to sentencing First Nations women, they stress that short prison sentences are pointless and yet significantly disruptive on their family needs, their housing, their employment. While on short sentences, they don't get access to services in prison and yet lose many connections in the community. A First Nations mother conveyed that a fair sentence would not strip them of their motherhood and instead keep them in community. Another said, I'm not sure what kind of sentence would be right for us, but I do know that many of us are in jail for small things when we could be at home with our families and most of all, our kids and grandkids. They said that the judge didn't see them or hear them in sentencing and they needed to be included more in the process. Some First Nations women wrote letters to the judges which they thought was positive, but many didn't have the skills to tell their story in this way. As an aside, Eleanor and I are doing a project that involves preparing narrative reports for First Nations people in sentencing, and we're doing this in collaboration with Aboriginal organisations because of the need for Aboriginal people to be seen in sentencing. Some women also felt there needed to be more access to Koori courts. So of the 162 women we spoke with, not one of them have ever been to a Koori court. So it shows the very limited scope of that court for First Nations women. Furthermore, women often pointed to how courts or police impose harsh conditions on bail, parole, or community corrections orders that interfered with their caring responsibilities, such as taking children to school and appointments, and this set them up to fail. One woman said, we all do have kids and we want to get out and stabilise ourselves and get our kids back, but it's hard, you know what I mean? We try, it's never been enough for them. You continue to breach, you got to do this, you got to do that, why can't they understand? They therefore recommended more reasonable conditions that accommodate their caring responsibilities. The other area of recommendations they made was that their criminal histories not continue to haunt them and prevent them from starting on a clean slate. Women describe their criminal records as following them around like a bad smell, affecting court outcomes, kinship care roles, employment opportunities, and housing. One woman summed it up when she said, it's hard to do anything with our criminal record. It doesn't matter what you do. They said their criminal records should be wiped so they can get on with their lives and stop cycling through prisons. Finally, they spoke about building supports in the community. One woman said, it just takes one bit of help to break the chain, to break the barrier, that cycle. Yet women were often harmed rather than helped at their most vulnerable moments. They wanted to decenter institutions from their lives and receive support from First Nations organisations. There are few of these. In New South Wales, there's Wominda, which is probably the only one that is dedicated to First Nations women and mothers. There needed to be many more. Another woman described what the support system should look like. And that's shown in this slide. And she talks about having, and it's really interesting what she says here. It's not simply that she has a solution, but she talks about sitting around in prison and talking about the solutions. They're not just, they don't accept it. They believe that they are worthy of more. And so she talks about the need for a place where you could go and get these supports, a place that's run by Aboriginal people. They know they don't want to keep coming back to jail. They know that they're the solution. So in conclusion, our research highlights the importance of giving voice to First Nations women to understand the harms of carceralism, but also to identify the solutions, especially for their children. There have been these 2 parliamentary inquiries that I mentioned. Both of them made wide-ranging recommendations, but they did not speak to First Nations women in prison or their children. From our project, we found that the best outcomes for families, including children, is for First Nations mums to be in the community and supported to develop their strengths and their families. The best way to start this process is to deeply listen to their stories and be open to imagining a society where they are not defined by the carceral system. Thank you for listening, and if you'd like more information, that's the article this talk's based on. Cheers.